So tonight we do have a guest with us, Steve Kleppin from the Norwalk Planning and Zoning Department. He's the Director of Planning and Zoning, to give us kind of a crash course special permits 101. I'll explain in a minute why that's important, and then we'll introduce Steve. And then after we have a short Q&A with him as well, we'll continue with our meeting just briefly to give some updates on the recent developments with the 93 Winfield special permit, the ongoing 10 Norton Place special permit, and tell you a little bit about what happened with the DOT meeting with the East Avenue planned closures that are coming up. And then just a review for our next meeting. And I will ask that maybe to possibly keep Monday, January 4th open as a final meeting before the Norton public hearing there. Okay, so special permits is a term that folks have heard us use a lot lately in reference to zoning applications. And so we thought it would be a good time, since we're dealing with some of them right now, and we've dealt with a bunch in the past, and we'll be dealing with more in the future, to just kind of get an overview of what they are, how they differ from regular applications that come in through zoning, and what those differences mean to us, and how the zoning commission reviews these items. So hang on. Okay. So we presented just this weekend, and we want to thank Steve Kleppin for arriving on short notice, a number just to go over what is a special permit and how does it differ from what we call as of right, something that someone can basically come in and apply for today and doesn't take a whole lot of vetting by the commission to approve it. Also wouldn't require a public hearing. And then also to take a look at what is different about how our zoning commission considers special permits versus the regular ones. And when they are evaluating them, can they be evaluated based on the impact throughout a neighborhood, or are they strictly looking at the immediate, the parcel itself in the immediate area? What are the special permit standards, and how many must the zoning commission consider? And are some of those considered subjective? And then if we have time for this one, special permits, as we understand it, have to comply with our plan of conservation and development. And so one of the questions we get is why don't all of them have to go before our planning commission as well? An important question we get is, under what circumstances can the zoning commission deny a special permit? If there are conditions that mitigate the negative impact of the special permit, is the zoning commission still required to approve it in order to avoid time consuming and costly appeals? What is the role of the P&Z director and his staff to advise the zoning commission on the merits of special permits and presenting them with information that guides them to help protect our neighborhoods? And we'd like to get some advice on how to successfully oppose an objectionable special permit in terms of what the zoning commission would be looking for from the public. And then going forward in the long term, to try to mitigate some of these things kind of impacting us in the way that these past few ones have, what is the process to remove a special permit use from a zone in our area? So if there's a list of those that are special permit uses, perhaps we can review those and suggest to the city that those be taken out altogether. Okay, so we'd like to welcome in Steve Kleppin, who I think we have to unmute here, and to talk about Special Permits 101. And Megan, can we make Steve a co-host and unmute him? He's muted.
I'm not, I don't think I'm muted.
Okay, there you go.
And I think you have to make him a co-host. I think only the actual host can do that.
Hang on there, Steve. I'm going to see if I can make you a co-host. While I'm doing that, I'll remind people, though, from a legal point of view, with these land use applications, unfortunately, Mr. Kleppin can't discuss any permit that's currently under review by the Zoning Commission. So we will not be able to ask questions that are specific to either Norton or to the, I believe, the Winfield as well, because that was denied without prejudice, which maybe he can explain. So we'll have to phrase our questions when he's through in general, or you can refer to prior special permits if you're aware of any, so that we can get answers on those. Hang on, Steve. I think it's coming up now. And you should be a co-host now, so you should have the option to share your screen if you'd like to bring one up.
Yep. Okay, can you see can you see that? Is that PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay, this, I promise, will be one of the shortest PowerPoint presentations you've ever seen. I know you have other items on your agenda. Just to clarify one thing, I can discuss Winfield Street since that's a closed application. Anything that's open in front of the commission, I prefer not to talk about. And I think the only one probably on your immediate radar would be Norton's, but yes. But Winfield, if you had questions about that, I could answer those. Good evening. If you don't know me, my name is Steve Kleppin. I'm the Planning and Zoning Director with the city. I've been here a little over 4 years now. I think I've been in front of ENNA a couple of times now. Diane had asked if I could discuss a few things related to special permits and zoning permits and the process and what the criteria mean and what's subjective and what's not subjective. Some of that I addressed in the slide. Some of it I felt it was probably easier if you just fired questions at me and I answered them, as opposed to try to put a slide together to discuss that. Just briefly, this is not necessarily what you asked for, but you gave me a little time, so I'm going to take advantage of it. Just because one thing we hear a lot is about, well, you know, where are we developing and why are we developing here versus there? So within and Diane had mentioned the Plan of Conservation and Development, which is called the Citywide Plan. The plan identifies several key areas for development. And this kind of map kind of shows you some of those. Merit 7 is, you know, a large office complex at the intersection of the Merit Parkway and Route 7. There's a large proposal in front of the Zoning Commission now, which will probably come back in front of the Commission in sometime in, you know, later in January, I'm assuming. You know, that area holds some of the, you know, really the most Class A office space in the city. Understanding that, you know, things are changing with COVID and probably are going to change somewhat differently than they were pre-COVID, regardless of, you know, if everybody gets vaccinated or not. So we're kind of, you know, still figuring that out. Then you have the West Ave Wall Street corridor, which is a combined central business district, which was rezoned in 2019. So that's been a lot of focus of the city's planning and, you know, infrastructure focus. Another obviously large area where there's a lot going on and is really kind of taking off is South Norwalk, Sono. There's a lot of large projects that are under development, wrapping up development and under consideration right now. So that'll continue to be the focus of that going forward. That's, you know, and what we're seeing in that area is a lot of mixed use development. And then we have a lot of other smaller nodes of activity. One of those being East Norwalk, which you recall, we did the TOD plan, which was approved a couple of months ago. And there's a lot of other small nodal areas that are, you know, throughout the city. And we'll be looking at those more closely over the next couple of years. But, you know, we're kind of trying to look at different things as we go and based on priorities of, in terms of, you know, what our office looks at in consultation with the Zoning Commission and the Planning Commission. And right now we're looking at an industrial zone study, which started a couple months ago, and we're about to undertake a complete overhaul of the zoning regulations. A little bit of the structure of the city and how it functions in terms of land use. Obviously, things come from the mayor and common council, and underneath him are obviously the Planning Commission and the Zoning Commission. The mayor had set up a cabinet-style government a couple of years ago, so there's a new, semi-new Community and Economic Development Director, which is Jessica Casey. I report to her. I have my staff underneath me, and we also have conservation staff, which is part of our team as well. So to get into what you really wanted to hear about, so there's really three types of permits that relate to zoning that my staff deals with. The first is a zoning permit, which sometimes is considered or called an over-the-counter permit, which means, like, say you wanted to put a pool in your backyard, somebody wanted to put a deck on or an addition. They prepare plans. They have a survey that shows where the new structure or structures are going to go. My staff looks at those plans and the surveys to make sure they comply with the regulations. Permits are issued by my department, then it gets forwarded to the building department, and perhaps it goes to the fire marshal if it's commercial. It could go to the health department if there's a food service or there's a septic system involved. It can go to public works if there's concerns about drainage and so forth. And we're refining that process, and probably over the next 12 to 18 months, we'll kind of clean that up and make it a little more streamlined. Especially, COVID gave us one opportunity to look at more online permitting and streamlining our permitting. So we've been doing that, and we'll continue to do that. So basically, once that zoning permit is issued, that person can start their work. The next type of application, which it's really kind of two parts, which is a site plan application. And since Norwalk is a coastal community, we also have a Coastal Area Management Act permit or CAM application, which sometimes goes with the site plan application. Those are applications that are reviewed by the commission. And with a CAM or site plan application, in a nutshell, if the applicant meets the criteria for approval, the commission doesn't have the ability to say no. They don't have discretion to say we like this or we don't like it. Those kind of applications either comply with the regulations or they don't comply with the regulations. They look at lots of criteria as part of that. One of those, which is kind of one of the big ones that comes up and is probably the one where the commission has the most teeth on denial, is basically centered along traffic. And typically that deals with what's called level of service. And all intersections are graded as part of a traffic study. And they do counts of how many cars are moving through an intersection at different times of the day. They count how long it takes for those cars or vehicles to move through that intersection. And if it takes too long, they get a bad grade. So the levels of service go from A, which is really good, to F, which is obviously failure. E is considered pretty much unacceptable too, whereas D is passing, though it's not good. So they usually study pre-activity, and what I mean by activity is what their proposal is. So pre-activity levels of service. So say that level of service is a D. The applicant uses industry standards on traffic impacts based on what's being proposed. If that level of service doesn't drop or is maintained, then they can say that we are not impacting the traffic. If they were to go from a C to a D, that could be grounds for the commission to deny an application. Or the applicant would have to ameliorate those concerns. Maybe that's by adding a turn lane, could be by adding a stop sign, could be something along those lines. Maybe it's intersection improvements that could be realized, but that would necessitate further action on the applicant's part. So the special permit is a little different. The special permit is a higher level it's a higher bar the applicant has to prove. It's automatically triggers a public hearing and a notification to abutters and those who live across the street. There are several standards that are associated with that. And I have a couple slides that blow it up a little bit, so don't have to worry about squinting for that. But the special permit, like I said, is a higher bar, but it also gives the commission some discretion on whether they want to deny an application or approve an application or not. Excuse me, I forgot this slide was in here. So I'll go through this really quick. There are a couple other things that that planning commissions and the zoning commission does. They can approve amendments to the citywide plan. They can also approve amendments to the zoning regulations themselves, or they can approve amendments to the zoning map. And anytime you amend the zoning map or the zoning regulations, you need to demonstrate why your proposal is consistent with the citywide plan. And typically what somebody does to demonstrate that is they will put their proposal forth and then look through the plan to see if what they're proposing is indicated in the plan as an action that the city should undertake. The more classic examples of what we see of those are where somebody wants to tweak the zoning boundary if it's close to a different zone that might be more advantageous to what they're proposing, or they want to amend the text to help possibly help a proposal they're looking for. The more broader implications, or the more significant implications of amending the zoning regulations consistent with the citywide plan is like what we did with the East Norwalk TOD plan, where the citywide plan had recommended looking at East Norwalk more closely and coming up with a plan for that area, which led to the citywide plan. This is kind of the preamble to the special permit section, and it kind of just kind of lays out the general purpose of what the special permit is and some of the commission's thoughts and actions should they consider looking at application. And then it gets specifically into the criteria that the commission look at in terms of any application. So as I mentioned, so the 93 Winfield application was denied. And since that's a closed application, regardless of whether the applicant would like to take an appeal or would like to come back for a future application, anything that gets discussed now and until they submit a new application is not part of the record. So it's not like you have to worry about influencing any judicial decision or any future commission application on that. So with the 93 Winfield application, one of the criteria that the commission cited as part of their denial was based on the density and the bulk of what was being proposed. So that one is, it's somewhat subjective in that case. The commission has some leeway. So in the 93 Winfield application, the structures that were proposed complied with the basic bulk and height standards, meaning that they met the number of stories and they weren't taller than what was permitted. However, the basic application requested was for additional density, which was higher than the site plan or as of right density allowed was. So in that case, the commission has some ability to determine is what they're proposing too dense? And in my opinion, what was proposed, the actual number of units wasn't a deciding factor for me. It was how those units were laid out and shown on the site. 14 units in a more tasteful and more thoughtful way wouldn't have really, in my opinion, been objectionable. But the way they laid out the units, which is very possible that they were modular units, or it was, the construction method chosen was the most economical for them to proceed. They were very linear buildings. It was there was very straight line proposal. Really wasn't a lot of thought put into how this looked to the street and how it played to the street. While the units themselves weren't unattractive, it could have been laid out in a much more gentle manner and much more in keeping with the general feel for the surrounding neighborhood, which was, basically, for the most part, 1 and 2 family structures. The next one is similar to the site plan application, which is, again, stable traffic flow. With this one, there's not a lot of discretion on the commission's part, because if someone demonstrates that there's stable traffic flow, we hire our peer review consultant and they kind of say, yeah, the traffic flow itself is not going to be impacted by the proposal. We don't have a lot of leeway to say, well, I really don't like it. Now, there may be other applications where there are other traffic factors that come into that argument, but the actual level of service would be a pretty straightforward calculation that's done. The next one is, it's a pretty straightforward criteria, which talks about the ability to get to mass transit. 93 Winfield Street, which, it's a little outside of the TOD boundaries. It's kind of at the far edge, but, someone could argue, yes, you could walk to the train station from 93 Winfield Street if that's what you wanted to do. I don't know if you would have too many applications that would hinge on an approval of that particular criteria. This one's kind of a straightforward one, but it's a big one in some ways. They have to demonstrate that they have, you know, the ability to handle wastewater, stormwater, and adequate utilities at their property. Most applicants, if they're smart, they will reach out to the other departments as part of the approval process, and then will, you know, seek out, you know, am I going to be okay with WPCA for my wastewater? How am I handling my stormwater? They'll touch base with whether it's whatever utilities servicing their area, and they'll make sure that, you know, their proposal is consistent with the programming that those various utilities have. And that's kind of a checkbox, but it's, you know, if an applicant came forward and they, you know, the power company for some strange reason said, yeah, we can't handle this proposal based on our infrastructure, then the applicant's either going to have to put forth the required infrastructure, or they're not going to go forward with their application. The next criteria talks about noise and odor and fumes and dust and lighting. That's kind of, you know, pretty much a straightforward thing. But some of those criteria, like fumes and dust, are a little hard for an applicant in the city to quantify, and I think it would be really difficult for somebody to prove that this application is going to cause you know, a dust problem or you know, significant fumes that are going to be a detriment to the neighborhood. Now, if that got raised as a concern by the neighbors as part of an application, a smart applicant is going to address that and say, well, here's how we're handling that, and here's the safeguards we've put in place to deal with those kind of things. And the commission could always condition approvals on you know, safeguards and other things. And if the applicant in the future, you know, once the application was constructed, was violating that criteria or causing a problem, then we would address that through an enforcement action. Sign size is a pretty straightforward one as well. It's kind of either you comply with the signs as outlined in the regulations, or you don't comply. Yards in terms of open space, screening, and buffering, that came up quite a bit during 93 Winfield about maintaining some existing screening, and there were reasons why that the applicant had proposed that they couldn't do that. The commission has a lot of latitude in terms of requiring screening and buffering, and the smart applicants usually, if they think that an applicant will, or a neighbor, I should say, won't raise concerns or will be possibly supportive of an application if they plant a row of trees and some fencing along the property line, most smart applicants will go forward and do that, because that's a pretty low cost item to address. H is an interesting one because it talks about what the impacts are on the properties from the proposed use versus current uses and versus other uses that could be in the zone. There's a lot of subjectivity that could be built into this particular criteria. And this is where the commission has to kind of think about, you know, if the proposed operation is going full bore, or whether there are other uses that might also happen on the site in combination with what's proposed, and how is that going to impact the neighborhood versus what's going on now, or other uses that could be there in the future. So that one is a little bit of you know, the commission's got to walk a tight line with that, a tightrope a little bit with that one, because it's, you know, they have subjectivity in their approval as part of that, but they have to also understand that when you allow uses within a zone, it can be argued that if you approve those uses as part of your overall zoning, you've already taken into account that there's going to be impacts as a result of those uses. Can you guys still hear me okay? I'm getting a little warning message on my PC about internet connection. Still good?
I think you just cut out for 1 second. But I think you're clear now. Okay.
Another one is kind of a straightforward one, but it did come up in 93 Winfield, where it looked at, and the commission had cited this as part of their decision, was, you know, while the surrounding neighborhood in that case was residential, mainly, you know, 1 and 2 families, what is proposed which you could argue is more conforming than a bank, since bank is a commercial use and multifamily is residential. There really wasn't any, condo complex or residential complex of the scale proposed by the applicant in close proximity to the 93 Winfield site. Proximity of community facilities, that's kind of an odd criteria because I'm not quite sure what you could prove or not prove with that. That's something I think we probably will take a look at as part of the zoning rewrite. And I know this was one of the questions that came up, the questions that Diane had sent me. Compliance with the zoning code, and more specifically with the plan of conservation and development. And I think the question was, well, how come that doesn't go to the planning commission as well as the zoning commission? So I think that in that case, what the commission is looking for is for staff to dig through the plan of conservation and development. And the applicant is, a smart applicant is going to do this as well. They are going to go through the plan and take a look and see where this special permit lies in terms of the plan, what sections of the plan are relevant, and whether, in their opinion, and also the staff will have to weigh in, whether this proposal is consistent with the goals of the plan or not goals of the plan. And this plan versus the previous plan is much more specific in terms of what the goals are, and just in my opinion. So I think there's a little bit less of subjectivity on the applicant's part to where they can just pick out a section and say, oh, we comply with this section. I think it has to be a little more specific with this plan. But the staff does kind of like the check on what is proposed by the applicant, but ultimately it's up to the zoning commission to make a determination of whether they feel it's consistent or not. Next one is relates to wetlands, water courses, and other similar concerns that could pop up. If the site or the proposal is impacted by regulated lands like wetlands or water courses, that application is going to get referred to the Conservation Commission for comment. And basically how the law works is the zoning commission can't act until the Conservation Commission has rendered a decision on any application. So that kind of, a little bit of that issue is taken out of the zoning commission's hands. And the last criteria is whether there's any zoning violations existing on the property. And if there are, that the commission can't hear the application until those violations are corrected. And that's it. That's all I've got.
Thanks, Steve. I think what I'll do is I'm going to see if I can share my screen again, and we'll go back to the original list just to see if we picked off some of the ones that that we know are. Most of this list is because we get these as ENNA, and we've also had to deal with these in the past as well. So when we look at the things that might be subjective in there, in keeping with the surrounding area, how far out generally is the zoning commission either allowed to look or typically look, from a parcel itself?
Well, I don't know if there's a hard and fast linear distance. I imagine there's probably some case law on this kind of condition, because I imagine that other towns have similar criteria that they use to apply. In general, courts don't like too much subjectivity, and they don't like too much ambiguity. They like where the rules and the ordinances are clear in terms of the rules and regulations. So so the applicant knows what they need to comply with in order to get an action on their request. I can, just while it's fresh in everybody's mind. So 93 Winfield, there's a big variability as you go. Make sure I got my directions correct. As you move east and you move north and even a little bit south from that site on the types of land uses that are in that area. But the immediate surrounding area of that site is, for the most part, like I said, are 1 and 2 family structures. There are some nonconformities and some oddball properties in that area, but for the most part, that neighborhood, how we would most define it, would be 1 and 2 families. But, you know, if you were talking about something closer to East Avenue, it probably would have been a much tougher argument for the commission to make for a property like that, because that's when the land uses varies quite a bit differently, and there are, you know, the types of uses and structures in that area is vastly different.
And Steve, I know you mentioned like when they're considering something to deny, one of the tenets of a special permit is that it allows the commission the leeway to impose conditions that mitigate all the concerns that they have. So if there's several potential negative impacts, they can impose enough conditions to try to either eliminate it or mitigate it. And then they approve what could be an otherwise still objectionable permit. So under what conditions can they just like outright deny it and just say, you know, we really don't want to impose conditions on it because we can't enforce them, or because we have to enforce them, or, you know, we just find it, you know, an objectionable use in an area?
Well, a good example of that was it was a gas station proposed up on Route 1, and I'm forgetting, there's the specific gas station that was proposed, but they wanted to put the, you know, it was going to be a store plus the gas station, and there were some residential properties that were proposed to be rezoned as part of that. And just to the north and to the west were residences. And so the change was going to be very large. And that was, I'd have to go back and look at the specific criteria cited as part of the denial, but that one they denied outright, where they felt that that use was not compatible at all with the surrounding neighborhood.
I think that's actually Cumberland Farms on Main Avenue, if I recall, which was that application. That was an interesting one. If people want to read one, that was an interesting process to read, then we might suggest that. In one of the slides you had up, you talked about that they consider the evidence. So are you talking like legally evidence, like what we've heard with expert testimony, versus is public comment considered evidence, and public personal observation considered evidence? Or are you talking about something legal?
So anything, there's two parts to that, I guess. Anything, the commission, when they review and you know, are kind of contemplating what they're going to, how they're going to vote and how they're deciding, they look at everything that's submitted as part of the record. So they'll look at all the emails that come in, all the letters that come in. What they have to do is parse out emails that are just, I don't like this, it's bad. Well, okay, that's fine. We understand that's your point of view, but why is it bad? How does it not fit in with the regulations? How does it not comply with the regulations? Because they can't, you know, you can't just deny an application because the neighborhood doesn't like it. It has to have a reason why. So, which is why the commission, you know, hopefully we're giving them good guidance when they're doing their deliberations and they're discussing the pros and cons of any application, or looking at the specific criteria and then stating why they feel it complies or it doesn't comply. So it's got to be based on, you know, factual information. When you get to a court decision, the judge is looking at the record, and the record is anything that was submitted as part of the applications. My guess is that, you know, if there are email objections that just say we don't like this, that probably has very little weight on the judge's decision. The judge is going to look at, for the most part, they're going to look. So in an application where the applicant has a traffic report, he's going to look at the traffic report put forth by the applicant and say, okay, the applicant says it complies. Well, the city has a, you know, their own staff, whether it's traffic, mobility, and parking, or P&Z staff, who looks at it and raises something that they feel where it doesn't comply, or the city has an outside consultant that says something doesn't comply and the applicant doesn't agree, and we don't agree with them, then the judge is going to have to look at how that the facts in the case and then have to look at how the commission went through their deliberations. And that's when they look at the minutes. There's a transcript of the meeting that's done so the judge can read the conversation. And a lot of times the judge does give the commission leeway in the record, so long as there's something that's, where it's going to be strong testimony from the commission or the staff or an outside consultant to refute what the applicant said. There has to be testimony to back up the decision. And that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that.
Okay, and I'll take the piece from that because we really struggle with understanding this is the role of P&Z staff in vetting these applications to determine where they comply and don't comply, and then rely on staff to advise the commission and to point out all of the areas that might be inadequate or where the applicant, thinks that they comply and maybe they don't. So does that fall to staff then to make those corrections and advise the commission?
So I can tell you and it's an easy one again, the 93 Winfield one, there were several items that didn't comply when they're first submitted. So if you recall, they went through probably 2 or 3 significant iterations of the proposal before it got to the actual public hearing stage. There were several items where the application just didn't comply. And a lot of those were with the basic nuts and bolts of the application, like how you calculate the height, how you calculate the number of stories. So we went through and worked with them on that. And we try not to get an application in front of the commission unless it complies. Now, the exception to that is if they want to just look at something conceptually. There's a couple applications coming up. I won't mention anything or go into detail where the applicant says, wants to get a feel from the commission on, is this worth me pursuing or not? What do you think of what's being proposed? And then the commission can give them an indication, which is not binding, but just gives them a sense like, what you're proposing kind of makes sense. But before we can go forward and before you can actually submit the application, you really need to do your homework and look at what the impacts are. So then they'll actually ask the applicant to work with staff on refining things and proposing things forward. The commission has to, at the end of the day, the commission has to be the one to make the decision on where things comply. Staff offers their opinions on things. And like with 93 Winfield, when you get into the things about neighborhood impacts or does the application fit in with the neighborhood? Is it consistent with the theme of the neighborhood? That's a subjective call on staff's part too. And we're just offering another voice in that discussion.
Great. And, we always look to have the resources that staff makes available to applicants, to have some of those resources available to the public as well as we're vetting these things. And we have a lot of questions and want to know what our options are, especially if it's something that the community is inclined to oppose. So I think what I'll do is, why don't we go ahead and open it up for some specific questions. We will, again, I just want to remind you that Steve can't speak to an active permit that is before the commission right now. So you can phrase your questions in general. And then, so if you want to ask a question from the audience, you can raise your hand.
Well, my question is simply that if the special permit, I assume it carries, it's like a property restriction. If changes are approved, they'll carry with the property. So that if the applicant sells his interest in the property to somebody else, that would be those restrictions. Would they carry through necessarily to the next property owner?
Yes. So if the this does happen sometimes. Sometimes people get an application approved and then they kind of sell the rights to the project so that maybe it's they can get a higher sales price if they can show somebody, well, I've got this approval in hand. And a lot of times that makes sense. But yes, the conditions, whatever conditions are placed on the special permit, those get filed on the land records. And so the application is bound by those as they go.
The lessees.
Yeah. And my next question is, how quickly can you enforce a breach of those provisions?
Right away,
Or
I guess.
who has to do it?
So it depends on what I guess if you want to call it a violation or where they're not complying with the special permit condition. If it's, yeah, I'd have to see exactly what they were doing. Sometimes it's a phone call to whoever the property owner is or the developer. And maybe that cures it. If it's somebody that's completely violating a condition, then we probably start a formal enforcement action.
All right, well, and that action could take a while. Would it?
Yeah, if it has to go through the citation process, yeah, that's going to take a couple of months.
All right. All right,
you,
that's all I
Judy.
wanted to know. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. The next question in the chat is, would CTDOT have any say on an application if information or studies have been prepared that contradict what the applicant has presented?
Yeah, so Connecticut DOT gets involved with a lot of, so anything on a state road, obviously, because they're going to look at the curb cuts and make sure that, that's not an issue for those kind of things. Depending on the size of the project, even if it's not on a state road, if it's like a major generator, what the state looks at. So I forgot the exact numbers, but it's based on the size of the project, how many parking spaces, there's several other factors, but they'll get a referral. Once the city acts, then they'll look at it as well. So usually one of the conditions of approval on those kind of applications is that before they can get their zoning permit, they have to get their permit from DOT. Now, if DOT came back with all kinds of concerns or something that significantly impacted the project, then that might come back to the commission again for, possibly even a new public hearing. Who knows? It just depends on the extent of the changes.
Okay. Then the next question will be from Louisa Fairbone. So I'll ask you to unmute.
Okay, this is Henry Chapman. I am Louisa Fairborn's husband. She's my IT expert, so that's why her face is up there. So I have two questions. One is about the zoning permit, the over-the-counter, and the other one is about the special permit. The over-the-counter permit, I'm just curious about how long do they typically take for something that you described? And for the special permit, I was curious to hear a little bit more about process, because in one of the slides you showed like an org chart that had everything pretty much reporting into the mayor. And throughout your presentation, I don't think that you mentioned the mayor. So I was kind of interested in knowing what role does the mayor play in this whole operation?
So I'll take the first one before I forget it. The zoning permits itself, over-the-counter permits. So we're probably if you submitted an application tomorrow and you had all your paperwork correct, it's probably about 2 weeks before we turn it around, just based on our backlog. But typically, most, and this is not to, just using my words carefully, most of the time we have to go back and forth with folks for a couple of weeks before they have their paperwork correct. Sometimes it's longer because they depends on the skill of the individual putting the project together. Second question, the mayor really has, the mayor's not allowed to have any input on applications. So the mayor's on there on the chart because the mayor appoints the commissions, and so he's involved from that sense. But once the applications are, once he appoints people, and with the blessing of council, obviously, he's not involved in any of the applications. He's not really permitted to come and speak. He is an ex officio member of the planning commission, but that's, the planning commission has that probably would be a conversation for another night, because they have a completely different set of items that they deal with versus the zoning commission.
Do we have a chat, Megan, or?
Sorry, I was muted. The next question is from the chat. It is, if applicant's traffic report happens to be done during a pandemic, can it be thrown out, assuming that most people would be remote for school work? How is it accurate?
That's a really good question, and we've asked that with several applications. So what we've been asking folks to do is do their best to go back and compare data collected. And haven't seen one that's been, I'd have to go back and look, that was specific to, specifically done during the pandemic times where there was obviously traffic overall is lower, especially the commute peaks, which is what people are most concerned with. Might be a different application or a different issue if it was like a retail shopping center, because that's going to have different peaks than the commuter peaks. So what we've asked folks to do is look at historic data and try to extrapolate and look at what was indicated under previous studies that were pre-pandemic to see what the data they're getting now is compared to what the data collected today is. I don't know. I don't think we'd have the ability to deny an application based on traffic counts taken during COVID.
Okay. Someone has dropped into the chat a link to a memo from March from the CTDOT that says that the traffic studies done during the current pandemic stating traffic counts this year are not accurate and shouldn't be utilized. So I guess that is just an FYI to consider. So the next question will be from S. Hunt I'll ask you to unmute.
Hi, it's Sarah Hunter. So a little context to my question first. The smart applicants is the sort of term being used about figuring out how to, for a smart applicant to figure out how to get their request across the line for a special permit. And it feels as if, then you come back to what they're really doing is trying to figure out how to get past the opposition from the neighbors. The thing that applicants, and the question will come at the end of this, the thing that applicants have is paid experts to sort of plead their case. And, applicants never come to these things with an expert who spends an hour explaining why actually it is too much pollution and they don't recommend this. Their experts always, net out saying this is a good idea, whatever it is that the applicant wants to do. That leaves the residents in a tough spot because we can't afford to go get experts who can then refute the applicant's inevitable result that don't worry, there's no problem, there's no impact. So when we're, as residents, in need of experts who can really kind of plead our case and defend the residents, are we allowed to ask the city to hire experts to truly investigate and represent the residents against the sort of every time experts say it's fine point of view? Specifically, I'd be saying around pollution would be my concern, and noise pollution, but mainly air pollution. Can the city hire an expert for us, the residents, to investigate and possibly refute the applicant whose expert is always going to say it's fine?
So it's not the city's job or the staff's job necessarily to work to approve an application or work to deny an application. We kind of have to, and what people don't realize, and I'm not going to try to single out anybody, but a lot of the, so with one of the applications going on, and I'm not going to speak to the application, but with the emails that came in, there were a lot of comments of, and I'm paraphrasing that, how can you approve this application, or why are you proposing this application, directed to the commission? And normally I don't respond to each one. Directly, I usually just indicate, yeah, we've passed your email on to the commission, so they'll consider it. But some of those I did address because I felt that was really unfair to the commission, because they didn't understand, and I understand that not everybody pays attention to what's going on at City Hall in terms of land use. Usually that happens when something's affecting their, or think that's going to affect their day-to-day life. So when somebody says, well, how can you approve this or propose this? Well, somebody's not approving this or proposing this. This is most of the time we're talking about private property, and the regulations in place allow people to do certain things, and they allow anybody can request anything they wanted to dream of. now then it's the city's responsibility to make a determination of whether what they're proposing is permitted or not, or whether what they're proposing would be a good thing for the city or not. So maybe we change the regulations to accommodate that. So that's kind of a broad picture way of doing it. We do hire experts to look at outside experts that are paid for by the applicant but hired by the city to look at traffic, to look at planning, and to look at design. We don't have anybody on call to look at air and noise and light pollution. For the most part, those are, we don't have, like I could pull them back up, but the language in there is very ambiguous about those standards. So there's not like, so for noise, for example, the city has a noise ordinance. So the applicant would have to demonstrate whether their proposal based on the sound study was consistent with the noise ordinance or not. We also have language regarding light trespass. And so the applicant would usually put together a report, lack of better terms, on light emissions and where the light levels fall at the property line. And then we would take a look at that and see if there's any bleed off site. So those are kind of, that one's pretty easy, but for air pollution specifically, there are really no standards for us to look at. As I mentioned earlier, if the zoning regulations allow a specific use in the zone, it's hard for us to say that this specific use is going to be an air polluter without, I think we'd be kind of on a slippery slope if we tried to regulate that beyond what our regulations currently indicate for those kind of things.
All right. Then the next question is from the chat. And it is, if a current as of right use is inappropriate for a neighborhood, how is that addressed?
Well, right now, everything in the regulations, each zone has a list of uses that are permitted, whether they're permitted as of right or by special permit. So technically, without somebody coming forth and saying, we want this particular item removed for the zone, and sometimes staff does that, or sometimes the commission may do that on their own. Otherwise, it would be up to somebody that, maybe a neighborhood group to say, hey, can you take a look at this because we're seeing this kind of impact based on this use in our neighborhood. So we could do that. We are, as I mentioned earlier, about to take a comprehensive rewrite of the zoning regulations. So all the uses in the zones are going to get examined as part of that process.
Okay. Next question is a raised hand from Michael S. So I'll ask you to unmute, Michael.
Is it Michael Spone? Do you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I guess my question was partially answered, not happily, by the fact that a global pandemic actually isn't being factored into the traffic study. So my question was going to be, so there's obviously no sort of dynamic scoring with any traffic implications, given that we have a lot of developments already on the table in Norwalk. So basically the traffic report is static any point of time that the study wants to pick.
Yeah, I haven't seen any guidance. I take a look at what the DOT memo. I haven't seen anything to not rely on traffic reports. As I mentioned, we try to get any applicant coming forward now, we ask them to, in addition to looking at what they propose, there's historic data, especially if you're on a major roadway. So there's usually counts available from either the state or the city. Police department also does counts from time to time to look at different things. So we'll try to have them look at other data sources to see if they can validate what they've proposed.
But I
mean,
guess,
if there was something we had a really significant concern about, we might push them a little further on.
But I think the issue is in East Norwalk, there are a lot, and actually all of Norwalk, but let's talk about East Norwalk. There are a lot of development projects underway. So the fact that a traffic study wouldn't incorporate developments on the docket just seems kind of spurious at best.
Well, they do take that into effect. So any application that comes through, the typical, usually I know if an application's, there's something going on in a neighborhood, is I'll get a call from a traffic engineer who will ask me if there's any developments under consideration or recently approved in a neighborhood. because then they take those applications and they factor that into their study. So they'll use the existing traffic data, put their proposed development into the model, and then if there are any other significant projects that are under consideration or recently approved, they'll plug those into the model as well to give them a more realistic picture of what the future traffic impacts might be.
Thank you. All right. Next is Farhan. They have a question, so I will ask them to unmute.
I was saying, Mr. Kleppin, thank you for being online and spending after hours with us. I think the information is both very timely and very useful. And notwithstanding the developments that are going on in Norwalk overall and East Norwalk in particular, I think it's a practice for the city officials to meet with its residents and citizens like this. So first of all, thank you. However, I was somewhat troubled by your answer in terms of the scope of the zoning department's overview and evaluation of the impacts beyond traffic that you consider when a development comes into being, particularly around noise and pollution. It seems to me, and maybe you can comment on this a little bit more, that you're operating under a very developer-friendly set of regulations, and thus your department has taken a very, what I would call, laissez-faire attitude to things such as pollution. So that if you do have applications that are going to be impacting pollutions levels, it seems that you don't really have a mechanism to protect the public commons, or you don't see yourself as having a role in protecting the public commons beyond traffic. And maybe you can comment on that a little bit more, because I think to somebody else's point, it seems disproportionate that the burden has to be placed on private citizens to come up with data that balances out the applicant's assertions, whoever the applicant may be, in terms of the positives of their particular proposal.
So I'll try to answer it a couple different ways. So as part of, like, say somebody was proposing something in an industrial zone, I can think of, we had an application that was approved 2 years ago down in South Norwalk for an indoor rock crushing yard. So the applicant had to demonstrate that the use and the crushing of the rock was not going to cause issues with particulate matter getting into the air and also internally into his site. So as part of that, we asked him to provide us with a report from an engineer on how he was handling the particulate matter. We looked at that, reviewed it, and then, in agreement with the applicant, made modifications to the kind of HVAC system that was proposed. So we do look at those kind of things. Air pollution itself is, that's a state EPA kind of issue, not something that's necessarily regulated by the city. So when you say pollution, it's kind of a broad term for, it could be a lot of different things.
Well, in other jurisdictions, though, cities and city zoning commissions or zoning departments do take pollution into account when considering industrial types of uses. So I guess the question is it just historical that Norwalk hasn't done that and it's something that needs to be looked at? Or is it your view that the city zoning department in Norwalk should not be looking at uses of properties in Norwalk that may cause pollution to occur? Air pollution, that is, or for that matter, other types of pollution like water pollution or other land pollution.
Well, I think it's pretty safe to say that if there was something that was going to cause pollution, it wouldn't get approved. I mean, I don't think there's necessarily something in anything in the regulations that kind of allows somebody to skirt any of the laws. I mean, if you had a specific project or proposal that didn't comply with any kind of air or water standards, I'd be curious to see what that was.
And one more thing, which is you talked about the mayor's inability to comment or to participate in zoning applications. Is that by rule or statute, or is that by custom?
By law.
State law, you're saying?
Yeah. He really, he should not be. So there's something called ex parte communication. So once an application is submitted to the zoning commission for consideration, the only conversation that should occur about that application with the commission should be only in the public, unless they're having a conversation with staff, and that's only like one commissioner with staff. It's not the commission can't meet with me about an application. They have to meet as a public body where the public can tune in and watch the conversation. You don't always get to participate in the conversation, but you should have the ability to watch the conversation and see what's said. So
sure, I understand that, but there's nothing that would prevent the mayor or another elected official from making a public statement, right?
The mayor should not be, as a good practice, and then I believe he should not be acting or trying to influence the commission on any decision. The commission should be an independent body following their bylaws and then applying the rules and regulations as laid out in the code.
Steve, I'll jump in on that too, if I can. It's Diane again. So we got some clarification on this. It actually started 2 months ago when there was an application that involved the traffic authority, and in the city of Norwalk, the mayor sits on the traffic authority as a commissioner, and so the question comes into whether the mayor is directing the zoning and planning staff, or if he's speaking as a private resident and providing input regarding a particular application. So, and just recently there was a conversation or a ruling from Corporation Counsel that allowed for speaking as a private resident. And so that's not ex parte communication. It's in the public domain and it's as a resident and not as a directive to the commissions. But I think it is kind of a fine line there. And I think it has to be considered on a case by case basis, but the statutory limitations I think are pretty clear.
So I can tell you that
as directive
15,
versus.
I can tell you in about 15 plus years, I've never had mayor or first selectman in my former job tell me how to proceed on an application. They ask what's going on, what the issues are, and I tell them this is how we're handling it and how we're proceeding. I've never had somebody tell me, well, that's wrong. They may question something on like an enforcement action, or why did you do this, or why did you come to this decision? But I've never been told to do something different than I'm doing.
Right. But in your experience, have you had first selectmen or mayors who have provided input to the commission just as a regular resident does? A letter or an email or expressing concerns? No expression at all regarding.
Not during an application, no. I mean, they may meet with. It's not uncommon for like the chairman of a commission to meet with the mayor or first selectman, but they should not ever be talking about an individual application that's pending before that body. That's ex parte communication.
Hi, this is Marilyn Marino. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi. Steve, thank you so much for coming tonight. I know how long and hard you work, so it's great that you came to speak to everyone. I think what I really want to speak to and what residents in Norwalk feel is what I would call the freight train effect. So what I mean by that is you have explained to me the process, and I think Chairman Schulman was also at the beginning of a recent meeting trying to explain the process by which an applicant can submit an application for anything on their property for a special application that they would like to try to put there. And it's like not the city's choice to not say that this person can try to put something there. But what I call the freight train effect is when I sat in on a recent meeting and somebody on that team had said, well, I started working on this project 2 years ago. And you're like, what? 2 years ago? So it's like becomes this freight train of a project wherein you explained in your presentation tonight where an applicant meets with various departments, might I say taxpayer funded positions within the Norwalk government over a long period of time before the application is actually submitted. So it just feels like as a resident, like, oh my God, so this, while I've been going about my life, this whole sort of freight train momentum for this project has been building and building and building. And now you feel like you literally have to go lay down on the railroad tracks. So, and I think the other thing is, you said that you neither can be like approving of something or non-approving of something. There's no one within our city government thinking if something is good or bad for our city that is like being presented through a special application where I guess you have some rights. If it's not really zoned for that, you would have some rights to say like you don't really want that use on a piece of property. So I don't understand where the government doesn't take a position. And again, then that becomes the point where you only have the applicant presenting facts on the record, which we've spoken about, the record that gets presented should anything legal happen with a certain case. So if the city is not presenting any facts on a record opposing the applicants, you know, what are the citizens like? So then the citizens were paying those tax-funded positions for the applicant to go through that process, and then we're having to pony up the money to fight against the application. It just seems like, I don't know, shouldn't the city be doing something sometimes or making some judgment calls?
I'm going to try to, that was a lot in there, so I'll try to address that as best I can. So there are a boundless number of conversations that I have or my staff has with people with ideas of what they want to do. So you don't see everything that we talk about. Most of the time, I'll pick on 93 Winfield. So we didn't know anything was going on or what anything was being proposed. I actually think maybe Diane or somebody from ENNA had said, hey, what's going on with the bank property? To me, we didn't know anything about it. And we heard some rumors, then all of a sudden an application showed up. So we didn't have any kind of pre-application sit down with them to say, well, did you think about this? Or would you consider this? This is not a good idea. This is a bad idea. So that one kind of showed up. So there it was. Some applications, we work with the applicant for a long period of time before it even gets to the commission. And as I said, I don't vote on anything. I have no voting power. It's ultimately the commission. I can advocate for something if I think something is a good idea, or I can advocate against something if I think it's a bad idea. Anybody has the right to request anything under the sun they want to do. Now, whether it gets any traction or how far it gets into the process is another story. I understand it's a different town, but when I was in New Canaan, I worked with somebody for like 18 months before they actually submitted something, because this was just a very sensitive project in a sensitive area. And it turned out to be a fantastic project in the end. Here I've had, and I don't want to speak to any specific applications, but I've had conversations about properties, probably, like I said, I've been here a little over 4 years now. So probably my first month on the job, there's still properties I'm talking to them about on what they're going to do. And I said from the beginning, I don't think this is a good idea. This is still a bad idea. But if somebody has something in their head that they want to go forward, they have every legal right to get an answer to their question. And their question is ultimately yes or no to the zoning commission. That's kind of where things boil But sometimes staff and the commission, we can't get emotional about things. We have to see things at the end of the day in very black and white. Try not to get emotional. And if there's 100 people with pitchforks screaming, don't approve this, we have to make an objective decision based on the information in the record. We don't do everything decision-wise based on what we're going to get sued or not. That's not always the deciding factor. But for me, sometimes if there's an application where it's not necessarily good and it's not necessarily bad, then to me it's kind of cut and dry. What's the information in the record, and should the commission approve this or not approve this, or is there a way to improve the application? I don't know if I answered your question or not, but it was kind of a rambling response.
I'm sorry, but I do want to say though, if the city is not putting anything in that record, like in other words, facts are facts, right? So the applicant is not going to present any negative facts about their property, but then there is not that other anything ever being added to the record of them saying, well, yeah, we see all this, but it actually has just other impacts that the applicant is not going to bring up because they're not favorable. So you're not even really responding to them.
Well, staff does for every application. Staff does multiple memos on it. Sometimes the applications are straightforward and there's an action in one evening. So but if there's multiple meetings involving an application, there's generally multiple memos for each time it's in front of the commission. Staff weighs in on things. Staff will, and how I kind of instruct my staff how to do things, which it's just good practice, is they'll look at the site plan criteria, they'll look at the special permit criteria, and they'll offer their opinion on whether they think it complies or doesn't comply. Sometimes an application is denied and it complies with 8 of the 10 special permit criteria, at least in our opinion it complies, but it might not comply with 1 or 2, and then maybe that's the basis for the commission to issue a denial. The commission is free to disagree with staff on any of the criteria, but we're just in there offering our opinion. So we do offer our 2 cents, and in some cases I'm not a traffic engineer, but I can offer an opinion on whether something complies or not. I'm not an architect, but I can offer my opinion on whether something is a good design, it has good value to the streetscape, it's in good placemaking practice, and those kind of things. So we're kind of a jack of all trades on things. We're not a specific expert in any one field, but I would say that when we put a memo in the record, it's considered expert testimony.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to ask that we move on to the next question, which is a raised hand from Marshall.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for making yourself available tonight. I have some overview thoughts to discuss. We talked tonight about the discretion that existed in coming up with the determination that a project is consistent or isn't consistent with its surrounds. And lots of other municipalities have gone further than it appears the city of Norwalk has done, creating manuals about what is consistent, what is not consistent. Examples would be a statement that when considering an impact such as noise, that it's a cumulative impact, meaning if there's a noise that's generated that's no worse than a train, but there's 100 of those, and there's also 100 trains, there's 200 events. And those 200 events have an impact. Or that the pattern for traffic that is one of the criteria that can't be violated includes the nature of the traffic, whether it's truck or car. What is the traffic? What is the study area? A project, although we're not talking specifically about the Northern project, how big is the area of impact? If you're dealing with something that has transportation impacts, well, do you go from exit 16 to exit 17 and everything in between, because the nature of the project impacts that region. So the question that I have is there any guidance to the Planning Commission about such things as cumulative impacts of noise, pollution, nature of traffic? What is the nature of the traffic today, and what creates a change in the nature of it? Or is it up to each individual commission member to think of it on their own and be possibly inconsistent among each other, so that when a ruling is entered at the end of the day, it should have a description of how that was arrived at? And so the question is, will that happen? Will there be statements that this was deemed not to have a traffic impact because, or this was deemed not to have, a noise impact because? So that's part of the question. And the other part is there any input that you provide or can be provided to help in that decision making?
Yeah, so a couple things. When we, as I mentioned, we're going to redo the zoning regulation. So I think one of the things we probably should look at are the special permit criteria and whether they need to get beefed up or not beefed up. So yeah, that answers a little bit of your question. One of the reasons we have outside peer assistance, specifically with traffic, is to look at the kind of things you mentioned. So because we do have some folks in the city government or city departments that have expertise in traffic. They're not, that's not their sole function. So we also bring in the outside expertise so they can address some of those questions and issues that arise. If on an application where there's more contention involved, or we think there could be litigation, when I put my resolutions together, I structure them a little differently, and I put a little more.
Let me just ask from another perspective. There's no onus put on the applicant to demonstrate that his noise or her noise, their noise, although it may not be on any particular instance above the noise regulation, that it doesn't have a cumulative impact, or that its traffic maybe even though it doesn't violate an intersection, it doesn't change the nature of the traffic, which are things that are part of the decision-making requirements. But then the applicant isn't required to demonstrate compliance. The commission members are not given a toolbox to work with to say, here's what I have to find out to make sure that I can say yes to the application. So is there a gap, and is there a willingness to improve upon that?
Well, the applicant is only bound to comply or demonstrate compliance with the criteria that are in the regulations. So if the criteria need to get beefed up, then that's a different discussion. But if they demonstrate compliance and the city agrees and the zoning commission agrees with that instance, and they're going to determine that they comply with that specific criteria that they're looking at. As part of good deliberations, the commission, and we put this in usually our staff memos and resolutions, indicate where we feel they comply or don't comply, and then ultimately it's up to the commission to discuss those various criteria and make their own determinations on whether they think they're consistent or not consistent.
I just want to say it's, as always, this stuff is fascinating. We really appreciate Steve coming here. I know he's got a big hearing even for tomorrow night he's got to prepare for. I think we have 2 more hands raised. If we can get a couple more quick ones in. And I would ask too that questions come from East Norwalk residents first, and then always, if we have time, then from outside of East Norwalk. So if you have your hand raised, Megan, we can take, I think, 2 more quick ones if you're okay, Steve.
Yep, it's fine.
Thank you.
All right. The next is call-in user 1. Could you tell us your name and if you're an East Norwalk resident?
Hi, I'm Dee Dee, and I'm an East Norwalk resident. I have a question for Steve. Thank you very much for meeting with us. Really appreciate your time. So I just wanted to circle back to the pollution issue. So you mentioned that it can be difficult to model pollution, or at least for the commission or P&Z staff to model pollution. But what would be done in the case where an applicant's hired experts choose not to conduct some fairly standard analysis to model pollution, and instead they provide slightly unrelated data in order to prove that their operation does not, in fact, increase pollution significantly? So maybe I'll distill that down. If they choose to omit certain analysis from their report that would indicate that the pollution would be problematic, how would the P&Z staff or zoning commission get that information short of the residents hiring their own expert and having to spend money to do that?
It's a little bit hypothetical to answer, but I think it would definitely be on a case by or an application by application.
Oh, sorry, I'll just follow up a little bit. I don't want to mention the application by name, but I reviewed an application that is in front of the P&Z Commission, and I noticed that their pollution evaluation was incomplete. I can see that as a professional in the field, but how would the P&Z staff know?
Well, everything decision-based for the commission would go back to the criteria and the regulations. So I'd have to pull them back up to.
Okay, so say an application does not provide pollution in terms of concentrations, they provide it in terms of mass. When the P&Z staff reviews this application, do they back calculate to try to figure out what the concentration would be to see if that does in fact meet the national ambient air quality standards, or are they unable to do that?
Nobody on my staff has any kind of expertise in that field.
Okay, so if nobody has expertise, does the financial burden fall upon the residents to hire an expert in order to prove that the applicant's hired experts' application materials were incomplete or incorrect?
If somebody came forward and said that this item that was submitted is fraudulent or is lacking or is incorrect based on this, typically the process would be, assuming it's under a scenario as you outlined, and I don't have any expertise in the field to confirm or deny that, I would typically indicate that to the applicant would have to address that. And if the commission wasn't satisfied with that response, I don't know how we go, the city doesn't have the ability to just go out and hire somebody, because typically we have to go through a bidding process and do all those things. So to try to do that in the middle of an application would be difficult, because there's statutory timeframes that we operate under. So I'd have to see this something specific to probably give you a more clear answer.
Hey, Steve, it's Diane again. And I think I've seen in the past where the public has raised an issue and not been inclined to go and do the research and hire experts and lawyers and spend money during a preliminary review of an application, and that the zoning commission then has instructed the applicant to provide the information that we suggested was missing. So I know that's one avenue during an initial review, is to bring it up then to say, it doesn't look like this applicant is considering, some standard or some other, expert information that may be out there. It still puts a burden on the residents to at least raise it. But I think the commission has come back to staff in the past to instruct the applicant to go out and provide more information. But you can see where we're going with this. It's the burden on the community, can be overwhelming, both in, time and energy and, and money and other resources. But that's an excellent point, Deputy. Thank you for that. We still have one more, Megan.
No, there are no more raised hands.
Okay. Okay, so then, Steve, kind of in closing, so if knowing what we know about these 13 standards of a special permit, and I just want to clarify something too. Someone earlier asked a question that said anybody can apply for anything. And I just want to clarify that. You can't apply for anything under a special permit. There are uses that are allowed by special permit. So for example, if there were 5 different uses allowed on the Winfield parcel, someone couldn't come in and say, I want to put a hospital there if a hospital wasn't allowed by special permit. Correct, Steve?
Yeah, they couldn't apply that for that by special permit. They could come in and then request a change to the zoning text to allow a hospital in that zone, then apply for the special permit.
Right, and that's a bigger impact there. So in terms of being able for the community to kind of fend for ourselves on these things that are objectionable land uses, is the only recourse we have is to evaluate each of the 13 special standards, that the same ones that the zoning commission are looking at, and then try to address all 13 of them, because we're not sure what they're going to be considering, and B, just try to counter everything that's in there from the applicant's point of view. Would be beyond us doing that, what would your advice be to the residential neighborhoods in how to combat an objectionable use?
Well, the commission, assuming they are, maintain their objectivity and they, just focus on the task at hand, all they're doing is looking at these, all they should be looking at is a special permit criteria. And it's up to the applicant to demonstrate whether they comply or not. Now, again, the applicant's going to put their best face forward on that and say, we comply with this because of this section of the regulations, and cite whatever they can in the citywide plan to back that up. Staff will also look at that and say, sorry, we don't agree. This is our opinion on it. The neighbors could get up and voice their opinion. We could have outside experts weigh in as well. But ultimately, the zoning commission is going to have to look at what those standards are, the testimony received by the applicant, anything put in by staff and the residents, and come to their own conclusions on whether they think an application complies with each one of these criteria. But it should be pointed out too, in some cases, not all those criteria are applicable to an individual application.
Right, but we can't really object on anything outside of the 13 standards that they're bound to review it by. And it may not be all 13, I get it, but there's no other, if the other points were raised that weren't in the list of 13 standards that they're considering, does that hold any weight or just gets dismissed because it's not one of the 13 special permit standards?
Well, I don't think they could deny something. I don't think they could deny a special permit on something that wasn't criteria related. I don't think it would hold any legal weight at that point.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you had something you were objecting to on an individual application, I think you'd have to tie it to one of those criteria.
Fair enough. Okay. Steve, thank you again very much for doing this. I'm sure,
Sure.
As usual, we can speak for hours on each part of the zoning code, and special permits seem to be the ones that create the most angst and, kind of work that we have to do in our neighborhoods to, preserve our neighborhoods. And so it's, interesting to see what the process is. I know you couldn't speak to one in particular that we're interested in, but we'll continue to follow that. And I know that when we do have specific questions regarding process on an application, and I'll let people know this, Steve, you can email into Steve and his staff, And if you have a specific question on the process or a question on something that's in an application, they will answer that. So, you know, he just can't talk to the merits of an application that's pending tonight. Okay, so Steve, thank you very much. You're welcome to hang with us if you want. Like I said, I know you have a big public hearing tomorrow night, and then we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. And if you were at one of our meetings again, because you've been our guest before, we would thank you and clap. So I'm sure everybody is thanking you for your time.
Sure, no problem. Okay.
Thanks, Steve. I want to before we close up, because we're running over time again here. Just a few quick updates. You heard Steve Kleppin just mention the 93 Winfield project was denied, but it was denied without prejudice. It means that the applicant doesn't have to wait an extended period of time to reapply. They can reapply almost immediately, and they can reapply following some of the aspects of that application that the zoning commission denied it on. So we're not quite sure if they'll be back again or if they'll appeal or what status that is in. 10 Norton Place, you know by now that the next public hearing, which is likely to be the final public hearing, but we'll see how that goes. That is on January 7th at 6 p.m. We'll post the links, and we'll continue to provide information out via email on how that's moving through and how you can continue to object to that. As I said before, there's a possibility ENNA will hold a special community meeting via Zoom on Monday the 4th, just to kind of regroup and make sure that everybody understands how the public hearing works, and if people have questions, and maybe to discuss some strategy. You heard tonight from Fahan Memon with the Sasquatch Hills Neighborhood Association, and it's in our email blast. I just want to remind you that they did start a legal fund in terms of hiring an attorney and also some experts. That is going to be a crazy amount of money. So they've done a GoFundMe looking to fund $15,000 of what's already been raised. I looked right before we started tonight. It looks like there's 9,000 there. So if you'd like to help the legal cause, you can go on to GoFundMe. The GoFundMe campaign is called Help Stop the Norden Warehouse. So if you do a search on that, you can go in and make a contribution there. And then just a real quick update from 2 weeks ago on the DOT, where they'll be closing down East Avenue at the railroad bridge for extended period of time over the next 2 years, and on East Avenue. That was approved by the traffic authority at 4 o'clock today. There will be no weekend closures July and August in the summers. There'll be no closures on the evenings in the summer where there are special events. And there is a commitment to work with the city on improved detour signage and direction, because there's a lot of out-of-towners that come through Norwalk. So if anybody has any questions for ENNA quick, I'm happy to answer them. And if not, our communications will be via email again. We do still have opposition lawn signs available. And we also, the petition that we have is still open. We're over 1,400 signatures right now, and we're going to keep the petition open right up until the hearing. And then we'll present the petition as a whole.